Welcome to a Bugajski Hour special from Washington, D.C. We will be discussing this evening a number of economic issues that will affect the lives of all Albanian citizens. And I'm very happy to have as our guest today, on the Bugajski hot seat, from the IMF headquarters in Washington, Nadeem Ilhahi. Nadeem is the International Monetary Fund mission head for Albania and recently came back from Tirana. So we have a lot of ground to cover, and thank you very much for inviting us here and for being able to use the IMF headquarters.
Thank you, Yanis. Thanks.
Well, let me jump straight in with my main questions. As you know, last September, the new Albanian government, the Socialist Coalition government, sought the help of the IMF to ease the economic crisis. Prime Minister Edi Rama at the time and since has stated that the country faced an abyss because of the policies of the previous government, including a very large national debt. Is this a true portrayal, would you say, of Albania's economic condition, or somewhat of an exaggeration?
I think the way to look at this is how Albania has progressed since the global crisis hit in 2008. And that's probably the best way to put this in context. Now, in many ways, Albania did not face the worst of the crisis like the other Eastern European countries did. You know, Albania's growth has remained largely positive, even though other countries in the region were suffering. Banking system was stable. So the situation has been deteriorating over time since 2008. And that has to do with the fact that the Albanian economy has become increasingly reoriented towards the Eurozone in the last, say, 15, 20 years, trade links, remittance links, financial links. So as Europe has seen problems since 2008, I think they have fed back into Albania over time. Now, at the same time, there was a need to have policies that could fight those shocks domestically, and those were undertaken. So where you have at the end of 2013 is a situation where the economy was beginning to slow, reaching, the latest number is that it was 0.4% growth last year, which is very slow from Albanian standards. And imbalances had built up, debt had built up, arrears had built up. Basically, it was an economy that was in a state of long-term slowdown. And the sense that I think the government had and we had was that there needs to be a jolt, a policy shift to make things turn around. And some of that had required a correction, difficult measures to turn the economy in a good direction again. And I think that's really where we were last year discussing with the government. So in sum, I think there are external factors, there are domestic factors, both of them coming together to create that problem.
But it was nowhere near a Greek scenario, tragic Greek scenario.
You know, I get asked this question more often than I expect.
So do I when I'm
in Albania about the Greek scenario. No, I think it's very important to be clear that I start from a step back and say, compare the two economies. In many ways, the Albanian economy comes across as very flexible. For example, labor markets. You don't find the kind of distortions you find in other parts of Europe in Albania. I mean, wages adjust quickly, labor market functions well, unemployment is high, but that's, there are other reasons for that. But the fact remains that this is an economy that has the flexibility to adjust to shocks. It has its own currency, and it has largely, as I said earlier, behaved in a way that allowed it to sustain economic growth even in very difficult times in Europe. Now, public debt had built up from Albanian standards very high, but from comparison to Greece and other countries in Europe, not high. So the idea was, this is an emerging economy that ideally should have lower levels of debt than is there today. And so the idea was to start turning policies in the good direction now, rather than a few years later when it becomes really late and very difficult. So I think that's where we are. In a way, the comparison with Greece is really not, just because it's an immediate neighbor doesn't mean you should compare with Greece, but I think it's not warranted in many ways.
So there shouldn't be a fear amongst Albanian citizens that Albania could go the way of Greece in terms of falling living standards, huge rates of unemployment, particularly amongst young people. Presumably that's not a major fear.
I don't think so. In the sense that if you look at the way we have looked at these policies going forward, of what we have negotiated under the program that we are supporting with the government, there is a very heavy element of structural reforms agenda in the Albanian economic reform program, which in many ways is indigenous. It is thought of because this government and previous government also recognized that there were some very, very intrinsic structural, embedded structural problems that needed to be fixed. For example, pension reform or electricity reform. There was no denying the fact that these have to be addressed. The question was these were delayed, and I think they are now beginning to address them. That in itself is a sign that the economy will then resources will be allocated towards growth-oriented activities. The other issue is that we are trying to reduce public debt at a time when the economy is weak. There is a recognition. But at the same time, I think there is a recognition, at least among us, that if the economy turns out to be weaker than we thought, then there will be an adjustment of these targets. So we are going to do it as we go ahead with careful thinking on how much the economy can take in terms of adjustment.
And the impact on ordinary citizens.
The impact on the economy, the impact on businesses, the impact on consumers, the impact on poverty, for example.
Right.
So,
well, maybe you could explain a little bit, because I think there's still a lot of ignorance about what the IMF actually does. But maybe give us a little bit of detail on this agreement, this 3-year agreement the IMF has in Tirana. What does it entail? What are the conditions, and what do you expect from the government performance?
What it entails is basically, as I said earlier, government wants to have a policy shift whereby it wants to get into a situation where structural reforms and fiscal reforms take place so that the economic imbalances that are built up in the economy are removed over time, and private sector becomes an engine of growth and export-led growth for that matter. So our view was, in order to do that, there is a need for external financing to come in and to support that. And that is what the IMF program is trying to do. Now, in the process, we, of course, work with the government on the different steps that they need to take to, for example, reduce debt, to improve public financial management, to improve revenues, all the elements that had weakened over time to create the problems that were created. So the idea is to fix the machinery of government in a way that when policies are announced and implemented, they are executed well. The leakages are plugged. There are no arrears being caused. The taxes are being collected in the right sort of way, not through a very aggressive ad hoc way. So that's sort of the orientation. Now, that some of that has required, of course, an increase in the tax rates, which
I wanted to come to
which
this,
has not been very, which is somewhat controversial. But I think at the end of the day, it is a fuller package of reforms. And we also support our sister organization, the World Bank, in engaging the Albanian government in the more deeper structural reforms that they're engaging in. So, for example, the energy sector, which, as you know, is a very difficult, long-running, loss-making sector, which becomes a drain on the government, on the budget. Pensions have been a very deep, relatively more recent phenomena, but also running for a few years, a drain on the budget. And so what we are trying to do is to support the changes that could come through that. And of course, lastly, the business environment reforms, which we don't directly deal with, but is very important for the economy in the sense of turning it back into a high potential growth rate. So, for example, removing some of the constraints, regulatory, legal constraints that businesses face in becoming nimble and becoming quick responsive to international changes, and then as sort of as a way of attracting business from outside, foreign direct investment.
I wanted to cover some of these questions just in a little bit of detail, but let me be clear. It's a 3-month report that's due at the end of June, and I know your recent IMF statement was that the government reforms are on track. So do you expect a fairly positive report? We're only a few weeks away.
Sure. As you were asking, how does the program go? Every 3 months, we will have a review. And at the end of that review, official review by the IMF Executive Board, a disbursement is released to the country. And so this is how we continue to monitor the economy, and it's a two-way interaction. So we go to Albania, look at how things are going. The government tells us of what it's finding, what its constraints are. We come together, we discuss how to reorient policies if there's a need to reorient policies. How was the past performance? What should you be looking at the next 3 months, next 6 months, next year? So it's in a way a very, very close relationship in trying to see how things can be steered forward. Now, in the most recent review, this is the first review mission that we were on last week, ended last week, our sense is that the first steps towards the program have been very, very good. All the benchmarks and the performance criteria we had in the program for the deficit, for other things, for strengthening the system, revenue administration, public financial management, policies, most of those things were met quite well. So in a sense, going forward, we think that Albania is on track in terms of, and that's what our recommendation to our board would be, that policies are okay. Now, we also do, as a part of this process, adjust to how the emerging situation may be like. So some things need to be changed. That is also part of the report to say, we discussed this with the authorities, and this is where they think changes will be made.
But you do have access to all the books of the government, because the Albanian public is quite cynical about what's said and what's done sort of behind the scenes. But presumably with the disbursement of funds that you allocate to Albania, you have close access to their accounting, to their books.
We do. This is not just now. I mean, it was also there even before we had the program as part of the, as you know, the surveillance Article 4 relationship. We would come twice a year and we would look more closely at the budget. Of course, the relationship has become a lot more intimate and intense in the sense that more and more close items need to be looked at. And in that regard, I think the issue is that this again is a country which in many ways has a lot of challenges, including in how the budget is done and how the fiscal situation pans out. And it's a work in progress. And I think both parties recognize that things cannot be fixed overnight. For example, there was a problem of the creation of arrears in Albania. Now that, in many ways, is also, in a sense, what I call a leaky bucket problem. You have a fiscal system that has leaks in it, and the idea of reform is to slowly plug those leaks so that you don't get into a situation where ministries overcommit projects, disregarding the total resources that are available to the government, and then you come down the road and you realize, well, we can't pay for these. How do we? So the idea is to bring that around into a one consolidated thinking, impose some kind of discipline in the thinking of, say, the Ministry of Finance at the center of things, and that is really what we are working towards. And it becomes, I can understand that there is a bit of anxiety among people. A lot of these reforms take a while. I think Albania has turned a corner, and it is beginning to make progress. We have a very intense, one part that doesn't get talked about at all, is we have a very intense technical assistance program with the country, where our experts, not our immediate country team, but other experts from other departments in the IMF, visit Albania very regularly to advise the government on how to improve the structure of governance in the fiscal matters. So that is also a very important part of the relationship, which is trying to build up the system so that it can become self-sustaining.
Bring it up to standards in the European Union and so forth. Right. Yeah. Nadeem, one of the fears I hear expressed in Tirana is that somehow the IMF will impose, or let's say a condition of the IMF disbursement will be austerity measures. maybe not along the lines of the Greek scenario, which has been quite severe, I would say, over the past few years, but things like higher taxes, lower spending on social security, public welfare, and so forth. Can you set the record straight? Can you explain how that works?
Sure. As I said earlier, the overarching problem that we faced in Albania last year was that public debt had run up quite a bit from Albanian standards, unprecedented levels, exceeding close to 70%. And the question was, how do you bring this down for a country? I mean, after all, why do you need low levels of public debt? You need low levels of public debt so that the government has the ability to borrow in a time of need.
Right.
Now, if you have exhausted or you are near exhaustion of those limits, then you don't have any cushions left to borrow in times of need, and you are prone to future crises. So the idea was to bring this down, but not bring this down tomorrow. Bring this down over a period of time under the program, get Albania on a path so that the fiscal budget adjusts so that the debt is brought down over the next 5 years or so. And so that's how this thing was designed. Now, I will say a part of the design was that, in fact, in 2014, public debt was going to go up before it started coming down. And that was very much a part of our program. Now, what did that mean? That meant that was done because we thought that any faster fiscal adjustment would be too inimical for economic growth. So the pace of adjustment that we have in the budget, of how the budget balance improves, is done carefully and is stretched out over a period of time. Now, having said that, it's to say it's not small, and it had to be designed right. So when we look more closely at the imbalances in the budget in Albania, a few things come out. One is that Albania has one of the lowest levels of spending to GDP in the region. This is not a very heavily bloated government of the other kinds you see in other parts of Southeast Europe. So most of the fiscal savings, if you may, had to come from revenues. And that is where we look more closely at raising revenues to pay for this debt reduction. Now, having said that, there's a general sense that once you change tax rates in certain categories, you should not change them again every year. So this is a principle that we hope to follow. Most of the discussion for the future adjustment will take place in our next mission in August and September, when the government will be beginning to think about the next budget also. But essentially, the idea is to encourage the government to find savings, whether it is through plugging of exemptions for taxes, which go to special interest groups, or to raise tax rates. This is in large part a discussion that we have with the government, where we discuss with them the broader envelope of how much fiscal savings there should be. And the idea is not to hold the government's hand and say, you must cut here, you must raise revenues
You don't
here.
specify, in other words.
We try not to.
Yeah.
I mean, it's a sovereign country, and policymakers want to make their choices. Of course, when we think that some choices are likely to not be economically very efficient, we come in and we advise against those or help the government figure out. Now, in the lead up to the program, which went to the board of the IMF in February, we had about 5 months of intense technical work through my colleagues in technical assistance departments, go into Albania and discuss the different kind of taxes that could be, rates that could be changed, to give the government a menu to say you could make these choices. And as you know, they chose a personal income tax which was progressive.
But the IMF has no
flat.
position whether a flat tax or progressive tax is more effective in
We take a bit of an agnostic view here, in the sense that in terms of the empirical evidence out there, it is not entirely clear which one is more efficient. Both have their pluses and minuses, and we have tried to help the government to suggest to them, if they wanted to move towards progressivity, that it should be done in a way that is the least invasive in terms of creating inefficiencies. And I think that's the path they've chosen in the last budget.
I hear that some businesses are a little bit dissatisfied with the raising of the tax on their profits. How would you address that?
You know, this is a question that comes up quite a bit, and I would go back to our visit 2 years ago, before even the program discussion started. And we went around asking businesses on taxation, and there were a lot of complaints. And one of the complaints that I heard a lot was that, yes, the flat rate of 10% is there, but we have a very aggressive tax administration which comes back and imposes penalties and fines and late fees and all that. So de facto, they told me they were paying anywhere between 15 and 20% in taxes by the end of the year. And in a very uncertain environment where they couldn't plan. And our view was, if you could create a system where you could say upfront 15%, and that's about it, then
as a ceiling,
that in a way is much better for businesses to deal with. Now, the questions that a lot of businesses will ask today is, well, yes, you raise the rate to 15%, but the tax administration is slow to change. And I agree with that. Cultures of these tax administrations are slow to change. But I think the government is moving in a direction where, for example, e-filing and computerization and things like that would remove ad hocism that exists in tax administration. So we are constantly engaged with them. Again, our experts are very closely engaged with them in improving the culture of taxation. And I know right up to the Prime Minister's level, there's a lot of interest in making sure that there is professionalism in these services, that the government servants who are engaged in the collection of taxes understand the other side of things, where businesses are doing what contribution they're doing to the economy, and as a result of that, they're contributing taxes, and they should not be seen as you know, to take a more holistic view, not just to say, well, we are here to collect and you must pay under all circumstances. That kind of cultural change, I think, is in the making. How quickly we will see results, I hope quickly, but it takes time.
Another major question for Albanian public, of course, in terms of the government's fiscal consolidation, is pension reform. There is some fear that pension reform will necessitate raising the age of retirement. Is this something that is on the cards?
So we discovered at the beginning of our previous mission about 3 weeks ago that the government had made public the consultation draft of the pension reform with the World Bank, that it had designed with the World Bank. And you know, I think if you step back for a second and understand that the pension system in Albania is a drain on the deficit, on the budget, for about 4% of GDP, which is huge. You remove that deficit, you don't really have a whole lot left in the rest of the budget. Seems all right. So in a way, the Albanian taxpayers are paying for excessive pension spending. Now, this is even more problematic in the sense that Albania is one of the youngest countries in Europe. And young countries means it should be contributing more than it should be drawing on.
Precisely.
So it should be running a surplus rather than a deficit.
More people earning and paying taxes rather than living on pensions.
Exactly. So I think the recognition is very broad-based in Albania that something needs to be fixed here. And I think it'll come out of the consultation that will take place over the next months, that, you know, how exactly it is done. But increasing the age, retirement age, is part of that plan. It of course happens over a long period of time, so that the current workers don't face so much of a shock. But there are many elements of that pension reform where things got confused, in the sense of social assistance got mixed up with pensions, and the government is trying to separate these and to say there's a social security element, there's a social assistance element. Let's keep these separate and deal with them in a consistent manner. It sounds like it's in many ways it's surprising that the government has advanced this. This was a schedule that was supposed to come later, but in many ways I think it shows a push from the government to say this is very important. This needs to be dealt with. Let's go out into the public. Let's debate this, and let's get this through, so that you get into a situation where things start improving. Now, having said this, I think it's very important to understand that you will not get immediate improvements in the budget as a result of this. This is a very long drawn out reform, in the sense of the benefits will pay off over a number of years, in terms of decades more than anything else. But I think a part of this economic shift of the government policy shift is to address not only the immediate problems Albania faces, but also the deep endemic problems that will haunt Albania down the road, future generations. Let's try and fix them now. And that's why we, in principle, we support the reform effort that's being undertaken.
Well, let me pose another question, which again is troubling to some people, which is potential rise in electricity prices. You mentioned this at the outset. Can you say a few words about this and government plans to improve collection of bills, curbing distribution losses, reducing government subsidization? How is this progressing? What can the public expect?
Okay, so electricity, I think, again, let's step back for a second and see what is the problem. Now, Albania has one of the richest endowments of hydroelectricity in Europe. This is a natural resource that Albania should be exporting. This is like oil, gas in other countries.
Right.
God has given you this.
Fast-running water.
It's free. You invest in the infrastructure, and then it pays off for decades. Now, what has happened is, where we are today is, this is a sector that runs losses, that creates an import need more often than it exports. And the import need is not paid by the consumers, but is paid by the taxpayers. Something's wrong. So the issue is, how do we fix this? So I think there are a number of areas here where reforms need to take place. It's very, very difficult. Multiple complex problems are intertwined together, and they need to be unplugged. More broadly, I think when the issue of raising prices comes up, there is also the sense in Albania, and correctly so, that a few people pay their bills, and many people, businesses and people, steal and are not part of the electricity net. So the question is, would raising prices be fair? And it would be unfair. So our view is, and I think the World Bank, which the government is working with, holds a similar view, that there has to be a comprehensive reform. Administrative measures need to be put in to make sure theft is reduced, losses are reduced. Some block pricing is raised. But I think in a larger sense, there are these two companies, the distribution company and the production company. They themselves have balance sheets that are not healthy. These are companies that are not doing well. And there needs to be a broader reform to make sure they operate on commercial principles. Right now, the situation is that if Albania gets even slightly below normal rain, even normal rain, it needs to import. And the two companies don't have enough resources to be able to say, well, we collect from the people, we can import. No, they have to come to the budget, and the taxpayers have to bail them out every year. And this, we believe, is not a sustainable system. It's unfair. It is creating a problem in a place where you should be benefiting rather than paying for it. So in a larger sense, I think if this reform is done well, it will release a lot of burden from the budget. It will also make electricity supply a lot more steady for people. Right now, you could be in a situation where if the government runs into resource problems, you could see power cuts. If, for example, you have a very bad rainfall season. Luckily, in the last few months, rainfalls have been good, so you're okay. But let's say next year, if rain is, say, 30–40% below normal, it will be a massive crisis.
Or if it's a warm winter and there's not much snow.
Exactly. And our discussions with the government on this mission were especially alerting them to these concerns and saying, fine, you can have a nice budget, but what about the risks? What about the fact that you could get into a situation where electricity shortfalls or rain shortfalls create serious problems for you? All your good work on revenue raising, on discipline, on fiscal discipline, will come to naught if this happens. So why can't we think about building something on the reform here?
We'll break now for a few ads. What are your views on, or IMF's views on energy diversification for a country like Albania? You know, there's this project, the TAP project, the gas project, which could be accompanied by the gasification of Albanian households, business, and so forth. Do you have a view on this, on diversification?
We don't specifically take a view on this. This is not an area of our expertise. But at the same time, given the fact that Albania will be part of the Trans-Adriatic pipeline, which is being built from the Caspian to Italy, the gas will be there. It will be in the pipes running through Albania. So it becomes only natural that countries that have that kind of situation use that to diversify their energy mix. And it certainly sounds like a good idea. Of course, this will have to be done over a period of time.
Sure.
And our view on the electricity and energy reform is that there needs to be some immediate measures taken so that the hemorrhage in the sector is reduced. And then there needs to be bigger thinking on how you're going to deal with your larger energy issues. And this could be part of that.
Sure.
Broader, longer thinking.
It would be a whole new culture for households to be using gas rather than electricity.
Absolutely.
Well, let me ask you a sort of, again, very important question for any emerging economy, and that's foreign investment. It's been fairly sluggish in Albania, I would say, over several years. I think the business climate I looked up is ranked 90th in the world in Albania. What would you say, what can be done concretely to improve the business environment, to increase FDI in the country?
I think a lot of things could be done. First and foremost, what you hear most from businesses is the uncertainty of property rights. Albania will attract businesses which will want to have certainty of tenure, contract, rental agreements, purchase agreements. And if those are shaky, you will never get the kind of investment that you want, and locals will not invest. So in a sense, our view is that the government needs to address the property rights issue, which is, again, interweaved in a complex web of other issues that go back in history. And again, I think this will not happen overnight, but the right steps can be taken. This is, after all, not a very large economy. So you can do things quickly. At the same time, you're absolutely right. I mean, the business environment indicators show not only a 90th rank, as the Doing Business does, but also a pattern of falling behind relative to the rest of the world. So the ranking of Albania, this 90 number, is getting worse and worse over time, at least over the last 3 years that you can look at. And so there's a need to reverse that trend. Business contracts, construction permits, delays, a lot of that stuff will get addressed through the government's assertion that it's there to improve the nature of business climate. The government is aggressively also trying to open up to foreign investors to address their needs more specifically. Now that in itself is a good idea. So doing trade shows abroad with your traditional partners like Italy, for example, and we hear that there are investments being made in the textile sector in Albania by Italian companies. Now, some of that will happen, but I think there is a larger need for thinking in terms of how businesses look at things and how they could improve the contribution to the economy. Credit is another area where I think right now things are not looking up. Credit has stagnated. But in order for the economy to pick up, in order for investment to pick up, we would need to have credit revive. And that links itself to balance sheet problems that banks face. But in many ways, the policy reforms that the government is doing, some of it will naturally improve the business environment. But I think it needs to be on top of the issues in the sense of thinking through the minds of foreign investors. What do they want? What can we do to to facilitate things for them?
Well, as you know, the government came in on a promise of creating something like 300,000 jobs, which seems unlikely during a 4-year term, 4-year period. But what sectors, you mentioned textiles, what sectors specifically would you say Albania has an advantage in which investors could come in and build up the industry, where employment could be created.
Right. We heard a lot, we have been hearing a lot about the potential for investment in agriculture.
Mm-hmm.
This, after all, is a very fertile country, endowed with the water, very close to some major Eurozone economies. So the price differentials are massive.
Mm-hmm.
And so the potential for export, for example, can be very large. Where are the weaknesses in agro-businesses to start investing? This is something I think the government very closely looks at. We had a lot of discussions. We heard a lot from them on how they were looking at the environment for credit for these kind of businesses, the environment for infrastructure, for transportation of goods. So you know, that potentially is one area. I think transport is probably another area, given that it's so centrally located. We hear about the textile and leather industry, which feeds to, as a first stage of production, to Italy. That in itself could potentially have large potential, in the sense that that's not very far. We had heard that the Italian outsourcing had gone as far as to China. And now that the Chinese labor costs are rising, they are coming closer. And you know, because of lower transportation costs, this becomes more viable. Now, having said all this, there are, of course, constraints on human capital availability, trained workers. And you know, this is where the Albanian government also has to think, as a next generation government, of whether education standards are up to mark to train workers for a modern economy. And that thinking also needs to be there. Sectors will identify themselves. Private sector will figure out where the opportunities are.
Where there's demand.
Exactly, exactly.
But as you said, it's a fairly young population, and presumably more adaptable to modern business practices, adjusting to the global market, rather than aging population.
Right.
So presumably that's an optimistic factor for Albania.
Absolutely. I mean, I think there is a bit of pessimism here when you talk to Albanians, that the immigration markets are now closing on them. And in fact, if you see remittance trends, they are declining. So the huge outflow to Greece and Italy, that probably will not happen in the future. But as you said, in many ways, that's a welcome sign. Albanians will have to find jobs in Albania. And in many ways, your educated ones will stay around and will contribute to the economy. But again, the point is that makes the government's challenge of creating employment even more. But I generally see that as a positive sign in a continent where aging is a big problem.
Sure.
Even in Eastern Europe. So Albania stands out from that standpoint as an economy that could grow very rapidly.
And in neighboring Italy, where it's
Exactly.
a major problem, I know. But you mentioned workers staying or coming back to Albania, the whole question of remittances, which have been a major factor in helping to sustain the Albanian economy over the past few years. A lot of people worked in Western Europe, but in Greece in particular, which, as we said, is going through a crisis. So what is the sort of impact of a reduction of remittances, presumably people coming back with less money? Initially, I think they have money to spend, but then when the money runs out, they don't have work. This becomes a burden, presumably, on the government. What is your view?
My view is that one of the reasons you have seen a slowdown in economic growth in Albania in the last 5 years is because of this. Households were dependent on remittances for their consumption, for their investment. And as these have come down, you see a decline in consumer confidence. You see that engine of growth becoming smaller. And that has to be now contributed through other means, through investment, through consumption generated domestically. My sense is that this is a bit of a permanent trend, that this will not reverse so much as the Greek economy begins to pick up, or the Italian economy begins to pick up. But some of it was natural in the sense that Albanians, having been abroad for many generations, would naturally reduce their remittances because their links stay with the home country, with the host country rather than
Sure.
where they came from. But I think the crisis has very much resulted in a sharp decline in demand for Albanian workers. And that, I think that's the challenge, the macroeconomic challenge that Albania faces in the sense of how to sustain that consumption. In many ways, the consumption boom that you had in the 2000s was driven a large part by these remittances. And that will have to be adjusted going forward.
So it was a significant percentage, I remember, of GDP at one point, remittances. How significantly have they decreased, would you say?
It continues to come down every year. The trend is quite stark. And you see the balance of payments, the current account deficit, which includes remittances as a positive. The contribution of remittances is smaller and smaller. So unlike other countries globally that were dependent on remittances and did not face so much of a decline as a result of the global crisis in 2008, I think Albania stands out as one of the economies that has seen an impact of declining remittances over time.
Would you say, in terms of, you mentioned now, but you mentioned before, the global financial crisis, particularly in the European Union, have we seen the last of those negative effects on countries such as Albania from the Euro crisis, the European crisis?
I think in the modern economy, you should continue to expect crises, maybe not as major as a 2008 crisis, but you know, this is what an emerging market in today's world is. You constantly face shocks of all kinds: oil price shock, monetary shocks. And the issue is that you should have enough buffers, you should have enough policy levers to fight those shocks. And this is very much at the heart of the program that we are supporting the Albanian government's policies, is to return Albania to a place where it is able to deal with shocks like this in a way that does not disrupt the economy too much.
And related to this, how closely is Albania tied to the EU economy, banking and other sectors? And in terms of foreign trade, how can this be boosted in terms of trading with exporting to the European Union?
Albania is very tied today compared to, say, 20 years ago with Western Europe. Specifically, I don't remember the last numbers, but very high numbers of for example, exports to Italy. 2 years ago, they were like near 60%. I think they may be like near 50% today. So half of the exports go to Italy. Imports coming from Europe. So the trade integration with Europe is very large. And Albania has spent the last 20 years increasing that share. Now, after the global crisis, some of that naturally went down because Europe was not demanding so much. And Albania's oil exports were coming online. And oil exports, as you know, go to the global market and whoever picks them up. So in many ways, that is there. As we talked about earlier, the remittance links are there. That's very much with Western Europe. And financial links are also very closely tied to the rest of Europe. So as you know, Albania's more than 95% of the banking system is foreign owned, and it's mostly owned by European parents, many of whom have seen financial trouble. So those links are very much there, and as the health of those banking systems improves over time, we should see some easing up in countries like Albania and the region. So in many ways, the destiny of Albania is linked to the economic destiny of Europe. And that is where I think Albanians see a lot of potential. But at the same time, I think there has also been a realization that perhaps some diversification is needed globally to fight the kind of shocks that come from a single partner.
Talking about Europe, looking also at the region, as you said, Albania is a small market in and of itself, as are all its neighbors. Is there a potential for, in particular sectors, for a regional market, a broader regional market that could be more attractive to investors from Europe, from the United States?
Sure. I think I don't think we're there yet,
Mm-hmm.
but I can see in the future a greater integration among the various regions of the Balkan countries, which are all at different stages of accession into EU.
Mm-hmm.
Some are more advanced than others. So eventually, I think they all think in terms of a common market going forward, and it would be only natural for that to happen. Now, I think one thing that stands in the way is probably infrastructure constraints that don't allow you to get linked up so well with each other. And part of it would be solved over time as that infrastructure gets built. The intra-regional trade is not as large as you would think it should be.
Mm-hmm.
Part of it is the history of legacy of countries being different and governed differently. But I think over time that should go down.
So in terms of sort of looking at it from a bigger picture, will the IMF package help to place Albania on a sustained growth path, would you say, over the next 3 years? Or do you think we need to not exaggerate that the recovery, the growth will be modest? In other words, not matching necessarily government promises. In other words, how much can the IMF contribute to growth?
The way we see the program helping the government is twofold.
Mm-hmm.
One is, of course, to correct the imbalances that were there in the economy. Now, remember that when private agents see economies with imbalances,
mm-hmm.
they also stay away from those economies.
Yes.
So if you have people who are willing to lend to emerging markets, they would come and say, what are debt levels like? What is the government's ability to pay? How are tax rates like? What is the investment potential in the country? What is the growth potential? So all these things are sort of intertwined, and in many ways, addressing these imbalances is something that, with the government doing now, that should put Albania on a good path. I think what's important also is the government's push to do structural reforms. Many of them they have launched early, others will come down the road. And I think those are the ones that give a very clear signal to private agents, domestic investors as well as foreign, that this place is serious for a turnaround. In many ways, other countries in the region have done that. Macedonia is a good example of having done that. So it's quite conceivable that you get to see an inflow of FDI, for example, coming into areas which are export potential. And as I said earlier, this is not a very large economy, so a few big investments can make a whole lot of difference.
How does Albania compare to its neighbours? Because it's interesting to me how people tend not to travel around the region, so they maybe have a slightly myopic view of how their neighbours are doing. How would Albania compare? You know the region very well, the whole West Balkan region. How is Albania doing economically?
The Western Balkans, I would put Albania somewhere in the middle. In the sense that in some ways the legacy of Albania is different from the legacy of former Yugoslavia.
As it started at a much lower rate. Yeah.
Yes, as I said earlier, I mean, this is not a country with very high, for example, public expenditures, lavish wages, pensions. The government spending as a share of the economy is small. It's not that large. There, Albania is on one end of the spectrum. But in terms of the larger unfinished reform agenda, I think it would place somewhere in the middle. It has its own peculiar challenges in a sense of property rights, for example, is a particular challenge. I think improvement of general governance is another problem. But in other ways, it's not that dissimilar. For example, financial system in Albania is quite similar to the other parts of the Balkans. All these countries sort of opened up their financial systems to Western banks at about the same time. Albania does have a lower bankable population. It has banking system penetration into the economy is smaller than other parts of Balkans. There's more potential there for growth. So in a sense, in some ways it is similar, in others it is distinct from its neighbors.
Do you think, we mentioned already the EU, there would be a major boost if Albania were to finally get candidacy status for the European Union? I mean, a boost for both the government but also foreign investors looking at the country.
It would be our view that that would be the case, in a sense that it would also be a bit of a reaffirmation of what has been done in the last few years in Albania trying to get to that stage. Mm-hmm. It would also give a boost to, I believe, private consumer and investor confidence, mm-hmm. that there is a path to which things are headed, and that good things would come Albania's way, including in the form of FDI. So I think that could be a positive, virtuous cycle, if that were to take place.
Well, hopefully that will come a little bit later this year. It's something that Albanians have been waiting for quite a while, and Serbia recently received, as you know, candidate status. Let me ask you the last question, although there are many ways of looking at this, but very basic question. Has Albania turned the economic corner? Or is the corner still in the distance? In other words, an Albanian citizen looking at their country, they've been through a lot over the past 20, 30 years. Communism, pyramid schemes, outmigration, corruption, and so on and so forth. Could you, I mean, is the message now positive? You're beginning to turn that economic corner? What would be the message from the IMF?
I think the message would be, I'd break it down into two parts. Mm-hmm. If you look at the policies that have been put in place in the last 3-4 months, there is definitely a policy corner that's been turned. So we are in a new world of looking at fiscal responsibility. You have structural reforms being pursued. You have financial stability being pursued. Mm-hmm. So in many ways, that is a big shift towards the right sort of thing. Do we see signs of real activity on the ground responding to that? It's perhaps too early to say that, because we're just 3-4 months into the process, and we know that these things take a while. But on the last mission, we did get a sense that there was a bit of optimism among the businesses to say, things have changed, and if that leads to investment, we should see the signs down the road. Of course, the challenges are there. Mm. And the challenges are many, and one should not exaggerate the optimism that one feels when policies like this change. But at the same time, I think the commitment that I find the government having made so far is quite positive, and that should lead us into a path where we start seeing sustained high growth over the next 3 to 5 years.
Would you say this government seems more committed to economic improvement, to doing the right things, let's put it this way, to helping growth, as compared to previous Albanian governments?
At this stage, the sense I have is that they have engaged the international community very, very strongly, in the sense of, and very openly. We were asked to come in and look at how what we felt were the problems, and we had long discussions, and I think the World Bank has done the same thing. The EU continues to do the same thing. Mm-hmm. So there's certainly an openness from the government to look at the problems and to look at solutions. As I said earlier, the policy shift is palpable. I mean, it's very clear that there is a sense that things need to be improved. Now, having said that, I think there's a lot of entrenched interests within the country, and a lot of these things take a long time to change. Some may never change. You may see partial solutions to some things. That is just the reality of working in countries like Albania. But I think in many ways the policy push from the very top is very clear that things need to be changed.
My very last question about the IMF itself. The IMF generally tends to have a negative public image in many countries where it does disperse aid. Maybe because it's the hard taskmaster, in other words. But I think sometimes it's exaggerated, that you come in, you impose conditions, and the public suffers. How would you respond to that? Is there any way to, let's say, to improve your public relations image and activities in countries such as Albania?
That is certainly the image. And it was also the image before the 2008 crisis. I think since then things have changed quite a bit. But let me talk specifically about Albania. So this last mission, I had a discussion with at the economics faculty in Tirana. And these are, of course, this was a new audience for me, young students studying economics, studying business. And I was open to all sorts of barrage of questions about how we are doing bad things to Albania. I was pleasantly surprised that the quality of questions were all about concern about the future. These are young people. Sure. They want a future. They want a stable country. They want a country that is on a growth path and that offers them opportunities. And all the questions that I faced were along those lines. Trying, as you say, to understand what are we trying to do to help the government, but also what is needed. And I think that's very positive, and that's the role we play, to bring international evidence of what works in other countries, what doesn't work, and to sit down and say, you know, you need to make hard choices. And I think there is no shying away on the streets in Tirana that the country needs to make hard choices. This has been very clear to us for a number of years. Even before this government came to power, there was discussion of public debt levels, and I used to be surprised at how pervasive this discussion was. There was a sense of worry, sense of loss that public debt was rising very rapidly, and future generations would have to pay for it. So I think a lot of that is very much internalized in the public debate on economics in countries like Albania. We come in and we try and support the reform agenda that might be there. Sometimes things get lost in misinterpretation. Sometimes there are disagreements with the government. But I think at the end of the day, I did not get any sense from talking to the press or talking to the public, including the students, that there was something fundamentally wrong in what we were trying to achieve in helping the Albanian government.
Well, that's a good sign. And hopefully it will be a major contributing factor to getting the Albanian economy on its feet and not just walking but running. Nadeem Ilhahi, thank you very much.
Thank you so much.
And for your candor and for greeting us here at the IMF headquarters. And I'm sure we'll have you back at some point in the future. And good luck in your work in Albania.
Thank you, Janice. You're welcome anytime.
Thank you. It is now time for my American perspective on the world, and my topic today is the shadow war. Following Russia's offensive against Ukraine, the world has not entered another Cold War. The Cold War was a frozen condition that divided Europe for almost 50 years, while the East and the West avoided direct confrontation. The new epoch can be defined as a shadow war, in which Moscow no longer recognizes the independence or territorial integrity of neighboring states. This sets the stage for intense competition with the West for influence throughout the wider Europe. There are three fundamental components of the shadow war. First, Russia's leaders no longer depict the country as a European state. They define Russia as a distinct Eurasian pole of power, defending itself against Western encroachment, and proud of its anti-Americanism. Second, there is no clear division of Europe into Western and Russian spheres, as was evident during the Cold War. Instead, we are witnessing a prolonged struggle over a string of states that are under pressure to join the Russian zone, but whose territories are divided, or whose governments do not possess sufficient capabilities to resist Moscow. Former Soviet republics in Europe's east, including Ukraine, Belarus, Moldova, Georgia, Armenia, and Azerbaijan, are squeezed by Moscow to relinquish their Western aspirations. The Kremlin also seeks to subvert countries that are members of NATO and the European Union by turning them into neutral international players. It employs military threats, imposes energy embargoes, and stirs ethnic tensions in countries such as Estonia and Latvia, and it offers corrupt business deals in other countries such as Hungary and Bulgaria, so that national governments promote Kremlin goals. Third, a broad assortment of weapons are employed in the shadow war, whether it's energy, business, media, cyberspace, politics, or outright warfare. It is imperative for Washington to grasp the leadership role just as it did during the Cold War, because Europe remains divided and is perceived as weak and indecisive by Moscow. If the US forfeits such a role, then it will witness a series of regional crises that could shatter European stability and demolish the NATO alliance. The EU and NATO must defend their strategic interests and their professed values of freedom, democracy, and national independence. They need to mount a sustained campaign to support each European country that rejects any kind of subordination to Russia. A broad arsenal of tools will need to be deployed, whether economic, legal, informational, political, psychological, or military. And in this prolonged struggle for European unity and transatlantic security, victory will remain elusive. Unfortunately, we have already come to the end of the show. I have greatly enjoyed being with you and with my colleagues at Albanian Screen. Good night, everyone. Stay healthy, be productive, and please remain optimistic. See you all soon in Tirana. Miro Pavshim.